Good afternoon. We are at the 50th International Congress for Medieval Studies. I am Erin Lynch with the Medieval Institute at Western Michigan University, and I am sitting here today with Dr. Marcus Bull, the Andrew Mellon Distinguished Professor of Medieval Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Great. So I wanted to start by asking you about the book we all love, Thinking Medieval, which you wrote about a decade ago,
yes,
right?
2005.
And I heard it's going to be coming out in a second edition sometime soon?
I'm seriously thinking about rewriting it in the next couple of years.
Really?
But it'll need fundamental surgery, I think, to bring it up to date.
That's great. So can you talk to us a little bit about how to use that in the classroom, your book?
I've got a lot of sort of colleagues' feedback about how they use it. I think why I wrote it was to try and help undergraduates who perhaps have very little exposure to medieval history in their school careers to appreciate that they come to the subject better equipped than they would give themselves credit for, even if that means that they suffer under misapprehensions and know all the cliches and have seen Game of Thrones or play games. What I don't want is for them to somehow think that the study of medieval history is simply more of the same. But it's a way of drawing people in so that at least to begin with, and for perhaps those students who aren't necessarily committed to taking it very much beyond an introductory level type of class, they can nonetheless see that part of the engagement with the medieval past is thinking through how the reality of that medieval past differed from the many misconceptions which slosh around popular culture. So I don't think it's necessarily something which would be of direct use to people further up in higher level classes, but it was aimed really to try and tease non-medievalists into the realization that at least they had a point of entry into a subject which they would otherwise think is very remote and alien to their immediate experience. And so to that extent, I hope it succeeded to some extent. I think its sales in the US have been stronger than in Britain.
We certainly love it.
What I've realized very quickly, of course, is that by using contemporary cultural reference, it dates very quickly because nothing dates faster than cultural reference. Most of the students now are born after Pulp Fiction, which is one of the set pieces in.
It is a cult classic, though.
It is a cult classic.
People love it.
It'll have its own sort of, it has a long half-life. But I'm realizing now that if I revisit this for a second edition, my first instinct was simply to update the cultural references, to give it a sort of quick varnish of topicality. But I realize too now that an awful lot of work has been done in the past 10 years on medievalism, on the understanding of the Middle Ages in modern culture, and I couldn't, in all honesty, write a proper revision of that book without taking on board much of the very good work that's been done since on medievalism. So to that extent, I'm going to have to rewrite it. I spoke to somebody at a session earlier this morning who said how much he liked the book but wished there was more non-European history in it. And I had to hold up my hands and plead guilty to the fact that it's very Eurocentric. So perhaps I need to do something more on the global Middle Ages because that had scarcely been invented 10 years ago but is now a major area of concern.
So pivoting a little bit, speaking of global and things like that and these larger topics, you've spoken really eloquently about the subject of relevance. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to us today about kind of the tension between the anxiety we all feel as medievalists, as humanities scholars, when we hear the subject of relevance come up versus having to make ourselves relevant in this day and age.
The first thing to remember about the word relevant is that it's incredibly slippery and it does the work of whatever anybody wants it to do, and therefore to feel besieged by demands for relevance is actually to fall prey to this sort of multi-headed hydra. And which bit of relevance do we attack at any one point? I suppose as far as the hard cash is concerned, what university administrators and politicians mean by it is it worth spending taxpayers' dollars to indulge people in, quote, useless subjects, while other economies, other cultures around the world aren't messing around, rummaging around 19th century subject categories. They are full steam ahead with a dovetailing of education and economic utility, which the West has failed to keep pace with because it's too beholden to now redundant categories. Now, I don't believe any of that, but I understand the force of that sort of argument. All I can say is this, that there is no case for relevance in those terms. If there were, it would have been made long ago. All you can say is that medieval history is one of an inner core of subjects which, by dint of perhaps being created in the 19th century and having a long pedigree, have nonetheless developed a capacity for enormous academic rigor. And as long as any value is placed on academic rigor for its own sake, medieval history will be safe. I think if we try to pander, if we dance to the tune of the relevance people, I think we are in danger of confusing form and content. Yes, for the purposes of PR, for the purposes of selling this to parents, to politicians, we can dance the relevance dance. But if that invades the core content, then I think we would be losers, and ultimately there would be no medieval history left in the middle for us to sort of make case for its relevance about. So to that extent, I regard myself as something of a purist. I know many colleagues are more accommodating, more pluralist in their willingness to think of the subject's utility in the modern world. I'm very presentist, only because I think that something like medieval history trains young minds rigorously, and then they can go out into the real world and do whatever they like with rigorously trained minds. So to that extent, I'm as much rooted in the present as anybody else. It's not the love of the past for its own sake, but my presentism is of a different order from those who make these sorts of rather insidious pleas for relevance. So I hold my hands up. I'm a little bit of a Puritan in that respect, but I'm unashamedly so.
Great. Well, so speaking of dancing and dancing through another kind of terrible minefield, the subject of, the Crusades, the medieval Crusades being used in modern politics, and that whole nightmare that just keeps coming for over a decade now. How do you think that we should navigate that minefield and kind of dance through it when approached, whether in the classroom or in the cafe?
Yes.
And how do we handle that?
There's a number of, I've been on record, I've gone into print on this, that I feel quite strongly about how the Crusades has become almost the poster boy for the misuse of the Middle Ages by modern polemic. My answer to it is this, that I suppose what the advocates of a connection between the medieval past and the present-day conflicts try to suppose is that there is some mysterious, long-lasting connective tissue, a red thread, which links people living in the here and now to the distant past, even if they are unaware of it, or dimly aware of it, or even if they only have cliched and very incomplete understandings of that past. That red thread, nonetheless, it exists, and it is our task as historians to expose it, and in the process scoring some relevance points to your earlier point. I don't think that red thread exists. I don't know how long links go back into the past, but the beauty of being a medievalist is you've got 500 years plus, and I don't think there's one red thread that's last 500 years. So my response to this query would be, what those sorts of beliefs resurrecting the past to justify current action is really about how vibrant and important the past is, even the bad past, in modern cultures. That the fact that murderous holy warriors plug into a past of their own fashioning to justify their actions says nothing about that past, but it says everything about the need to justify the present. So the answer in essence is, this isn't about the past at all, it's about how human action is constantly looking for legitimation. And currently we're going through a period where the past has become disproportionately important as a site of legitimation. Perhaps in some cases because of the waning of certain ideologies, and the past is always there as the sort of default resource. Well, they did it in the past, and we're somehow locked into that. It turns history into a sort of inevitable playing out of things that happened long ago. We are simply puppets dancing to something that was scripted ages ago. Of course we're not. We are much more in control of the present than we give ourselves credit for. for. So to that extent, this specious use, for example, of the Crusades to explain the present it's just that. It's specious, it's presentist, it's short-termist, and bottom line, intellectually vacuous. It's hollow. There's nothing to it, and I wish it would stop.
Yeah.
But it won't.
I'm with you.
But I wish it would stop.
Yeah. So let me just ask you before we wrap up, what are you working on now, and how is your work fitting into where Crusades history is and going?
Well, I never was a Crusade historian. I was simply somebody who did a PhD with Jonathan Riley Smith, and like a small moon around a very large planet. I've been circling that planet ever since. But I'm working currently, I had a fellowship at the National Humanities Centre this year, and I'm working on 2 books. One, a study of why we attach so much importance to eyewitness evidence.
Oh.
And I'm looking at texts written in the 12th and 13th century by people who claim to be eyewitnesses to events. And I'm trying to plug that into a lot of interesting work that has been done in a field which historians scarcely look at, which is the cognitive psychology of eyewitness perception.
Oh, great.
And something like 5,000 articles on eyewitnessing have been published in scientific journals since the 80s, but this scarcely seeps through into historical debate. So I've been through, I'd like to say I've read 5,000 articles, but I've read enough to be able, I think, to plug that into my analysis of these texts. And then secondly, I'm committing heresy. I'm reinventing myself as an early modernist.
Oh boy.
And I'm doing a book on the perceptions and narrativization of the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, which generated a cluster of eyewitness and other narratives similar to the cluster of narratives that, for example, gathered around the First Crusade. So I'm trying to extend the sort of theoretical, methodological approaches I will have been developing with the medieval material to see what happens if you apply it to a relatively early modern topic.
Great. That is so exciting. I'm looking forward to reading them.
Well, hopefully the first one will be out next year, and Malta will be out in 2 or 3 years after that.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.